On Memorial Day weekend in 1996, the sun still kissed the edges of California's Central Coast. College students were buzzing with energy, pouring out of dorm rooms and apartments at California Polytechnic State University, or Cal Poly, as everyone called it. The school year was winding down, finals were looming, and for many students, it was one of the last chances to cut loose before summer break. Among them was Kristin Smart, a 19-year-old freshman from Stockton, California. A statuesque young woman with a striking smile, Kristin stood nearly 6 feet tall, but what truly set her apart was her energy. Vibrant, curious, and bold. She had dreams of becoming a journalist. She wanted to see the world. But that weekend, all she wanted was to go to a party. It was May 24th, a Friday. Kristin didn't know that her decision to go out that night would be the last one she'd ever make freely. Kristin had called her parents that week. Her grades were suffering, and she admitted that college wasn't going quite how she'd expected. But she was still hopeful. She told them she'd be home for the summer soon, ready to reset and refocus. Her mom, Denise Smart, later said something about that call stuck with her, a mother's instinct. Something felt off. Kristin lived in Muir Hall, one of Cal Poly's dormitories. She shared the space with other students, just like any college freshman. That Friday evening, she tried to get a few friends to come with her to a party being held off campus on Crandall Way. It was a birthday party for a student. Small, nothing wild, just the usual mix of drinks, music, and socializing. Her friends declined. Some had other plans. Others were tired. So Kristin decided to go alone. She dressed casually, wearing black shorts, a gray t-shirt, and red shoes. And sometime around 8:30 p.m., she left the dorm. The Crandall Way party. Crandall Way was only a short walk from campus, a row of modest homes often rented by students. The party Kristin showed up to was already underway, but not overly crowded. She mingled. She laughed. A few witnesses recalled she'd had some drinks. Maybe more than a few. She was unsteady on her feet by the time the clock ticked past 1:30 a.m. It was around that time, after the party had started to thin out, that Kristin was seen lying on the lawn outside the house, apparently passed out. That's when Cheryl Anderson, another student, noticed her. Cheryl didn't know Kristin personally, but she wasn't about to leave a girl drunk and alone on the grass in the middle of the night. So she and another student, Paul Flores, a 19-year-old freshman, helped Kristin up. Together, the three began the walk back toward the dorms. What happened next is where the mystery begins. It was around 2 a.m. Cheryl Anderson, Kristin, and Paul Flores walked together for a while. But Cheryl split off first. Her dorm was closer. That left just Kristin and Paul. Paul would later say he walked her as far as the corner near Santa Lucia Hall, where he claimed she insisted she could make it the rest of the way on her own. But no one ever saw Kristin again. Saturday passed quietly. Kristin's friends assumed she'd gone to the beach or stayed over at a friend's. It wasn't unusual to be incommunicado over a holiday weekend, especially in the 90s. No cell phones, no instant social media check-ins. But when Sunday came and went with no sign of her, the concern began to mount. Her roommate reported her missing to campus police. But instead of springing into action, Cal Poly treated the situation casually. They suggested Kristin had probably gone on a spontaneous trip. That maybe she was just being a college kid. They waited. Hours passed. Then days. And by the time they realized something was wrong, truly wrong, it was far too late. Back in Stockton, Kristin's family was frantic. They drove to San Luis Obispo, plastered the town with flyers, begged for media attention, and tried to pressure the university to act. Her parents immediately felt something dark had happened. This wasn't like Kristin. She didn't run off, her mother told reporters. She didn't just disappear. Somebody knows what happened. From the beginning, Paul Flores stood out. He was the last known person to see Kristin alive. And when police spoke to him, they noticed oddities. He had a black eye. He claimed it happened while playing basketball, but his story changed. First he said he got elbowed, then that he hit his head on his truck's steering wheel. He seemed nervous, uncooperative, defensive. But without a body, without hard evidence, and without a crime scene, police were limited in what they could do. Cal Poly's campus was never locked down. Kristin's dorm room wasn't immediately searched. Surveillance footage from that night? Non-existent or gone. And as days became weeks, Paul Flores went back to class. Kristin Smart, however, had vanished without a trace. The early investigation and lost time. Searches were launched. Dogs were brought in. They hit on Paul Flores's dorm room, specifically on the mattress in his room. Cadaver dogs trained to detect human decomposition showed strong reactions. But Flores had already moved out, and the mattress? It was gone. Still, law enforcement grew more certain. Paul Flores was the key. The Smart family remained publicly composed but privately devastated. They hired private investigators. They pushed local media. They watched Paul Flores and watched him remain free. Silence sets in. As months passed, the case stalled. Rumors spread on campus. People whispered that Kristin had been drunk, had wandered off. Some even blamed her. But those who knew her, her family, her friends, never accepted that. In 2002, Kristin Smart was legally declared dead. But her body had still not been found. And Paul Flores remained the primary and only person of interest. Still, the case went nowhere. Behind the scenes, investigators kept working. Technology has evolved. Evidence that once seemed weak was being re-examined with new tools. But the silence continued. A generation later, a break. In 2019, over 2 decades after Kristin Smart disappeared, a new voice entered the conversation. Chris Lambert, a local musician and podcaster, began digging into the case. His podcast, Your Own Backyard, shined a spotlight back onto the details of that night, and particularly onto Paul Flores. Lambert unearthed new witnesses, brought renewed media attention, and inspired many to speak for the first time. Suddenly, there was momentum. And then, finally, the truth began to surface. After 25 years of silence, lies, and heartbreak, the case that had haunted Cal Poly and Kristin Smart's family was no longer cold. A podcast had reignited interest. Law enforcement was closing in. And Paul Flores. His secrets weren't safe anymore. But what really happened that night in 1996? And what had he hidden for over 2 decades? The sun had already risen on Saturday morning, May 25, 1996. But Kristin Smart was nowhere to be found. Her friends thought she might have stayed out, maybe went to the beach. It was Memorial Day weekend, after all. But Paul Flores, he knew exactly where she was. And he wasn't saying a word. The first lie. In the early hours after Kristin Smart vanished, Cal Poly's campus police waited. They chalked it up to typical college behavior. But when Kristin didn't show up for classes, didn't return to her dorm, and never called her family, something that should have been obvious began to take shape. This wasn't a weekend getaway. It was a crime scene with no body. And only one man had been alone with her in the final moments. Paul Flores. When questioned by police, Paul gave a basic account. He walked Kristin back part of the way to her dorm, then let her walk the rest alone. He claimed she'd been insistent that he didn't need to escort her further. No one else saw that exchange. No one saw Kristin enter her dorm. No surveillance footage confirmed it. But what really caught detectives' attention was Paul's face. A black eye, faint but noticeable. Excuses. Excuses. Paul gave conflicting explanations about how he got the black eye. First, he told police he got it while playing basketball with friends. But when those friends were interviewed, none of them recalled that happening. Later, Paul changed his story, saying he hit his head on his truck steering wheel. Then, he claimed he didn't know how it happened. The inconsistencies were glaring. And then there was his behavior. According to officers, Paul sweated profusely during questioning. He rambled. He was evasive. He cracked inappropriate jokes, even asking investigators if he should get a lawyer. Still, it wasn't enough. They had no body, no witnesses placing Paul with Kristin after Cheryl Anderson parted ways with them, and no confession. He slipped away, for the time being. Red flags. As the weeks turned into months, detectives quietly focused on Paul Flores. A search warrant was executed for his dorm room. What they found was both revealing and frustrating. Paul's mattress was gone. Missing. A new mattress had been placed in the room. A clean one. No blood. No evidence. No Kristin. But when cadaver dogs were brought in, all 3 dogs independently alerted to the corner of Flores's mattress location. Their behavior suggested something once decomposed, or had been dead, in that spot. But without the original mattress, without forensic proof, they were at a dead end. A pattern of silence. Paul's family quickly closed ranks. His father, Ruben Flores, a former city worker, and his mother, Susan Flores, refused to allow law enforcement to search their properties without a warrant. Paul's mother even hired a lawyer for him almost immediately. Rare for a 19-year-old student with no formal charges against him. She also refused police access to her Arroyo Grande home, where Paul had been staying after the semester ended. Was she protecting her son? Or was she hiding something else? One thing was clear. Paul Flores wasn't just a person of interest. He was the only suspect. 1997. The grand jury that went nowhere. In the spring of 1997, almost a year after Kristin disappeared, a grand jury was convened in San Luis Obispo County. More than 100 witnesses were interviewed. Dozens of leads were re-examined. Investigators were sure they had the right man. But without a body, without DNA, and without a confession, no charges were filed. Kristin Smart's case went cold. The Smart family's nightmare. While Paul Flores continued his life, taking jobs, living quietly, rarely speaking to anyone about that night, Kristin's parents, Stan and Denise Smart, were waging a silent war against the system. They believed that Paul had killed their daughter. But they also believed that Cal Poly, local law enforcement, and even the legal system had failed them. They filed a civil suit against Paul Flores in 2002, officially accusing him of Kristin's wrongful death. Again, Paul refused to answer any meaningful questions, pleading the Fifth Amendment over and over during depositions. Later that year, a judge declared Kristin legally dead. For the Smart family, it was a formality that crushed them. There was no body to bury, no gravestone to visit, just a date on paper, and a gaping wound that refused to close. The other side of Paul Flores. As time passed, new allegations began to surface, quietly at first, then more loudly. In 2006, a woman came forward saying that Paul Flores had tried to rape her in the early 2000s. Others whispered about his disturbing behavior, that he made women uncomfortable, that he stalked classmates, that he drank heavily and became aggressive. Law enforcement started looking at Paul differently, not just as a suspect in a disappearance, but potentially as a serial predator. But still, no charges, no justice. A podcast reopens a wound. In 2019, a soft-spoken musician named Chris Lambert felt haunted by the Kristin Smart case. He lived near Cal Poly. He remembered the missing posters from his youth. And he realized the world had largely forgotten Kristin Smart. Lambert launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard, and it changed everything. With careful research, in-depth interviews, and a relentless focus on the facts, Lambert did what no one else had. He told Kristin's story in full and put Paul Flores back in the spotlight. The podcast was gripping, and it went viral. Suddenly, new witnesses came forward. People who'd been afraid to speak before. People who said they saw or heard things. People who had secrets. The tipping point. Lambert's podcast reignited public pressure. Law enforcement began re-examining the case. And in 2020, investigators executed new search warrants at the homes of Paul Flores, his mother Susan, and his father Ruben. At Ruben Flores's home in Arroyo Grande, ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly beneath the back deck. A short time later, cadaver dogs were brought in. They hit again. Soil samples were taken. The area was excavated. And although Kristin's remains weren't found, investigators believed they had found evidence of human decomposition in the soil, consistent with a body once being buried there, and then moved. The walls were closing in on Paul Flores. It had been 24 years. 24 years of silence, of a suspect hiding behind legal walls, of a family living in agony. But now, the cracks were showing. And what investigators believed next would blow the case wide open. For decades, the case of Kristin Smart sat in a cold case file. A missing girl, a silent suspect, and a grieving family left to imagine the horror of what might have happened. But as the calendar turned to 2020, a ripple began turning into a wave. That ripple was a podcast. That wave was about to break directly over the home of Ruben Flores, Paul's father, and what lay beneath his backyard deck. The search that changed everything. In March 2021, 25 years after Kristin vanished, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office returned to the house on White Court, Ruben Flores' residence in Arroyo Grande. This wasn't the first time they had searched for it, but now they had new evidence. They brought cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radars, and forensic archaeologists. The area beneath the deck, a patch of disturbed earth, had been flagged in earlier tests. It looked like a human-sized void, as if someone had been buried there, and later removed. The soil showed signs of bodily fluids consistent with human decomposition. There were fibers, biological material, and a clear impression in the dirt, a stain that seemed to scream what investigators already believed. Kristin Smart had once been buried here. On April 13, 2021, two words echoed through headlines across California. Arrest made. Paul Flores was arrested at his San Pedro home and charged with Kristin Smart's murder. Hours later, Ruben Flores, now 80 years old, was arrested at his Arroyo Grande home and charged with being an accessory after the fact, accused of helping his son hide Kristin's body and then moving it years later to avoid detection. The community that had waited over 2 decades for justice held its breath. The Smart family, long denied answers, stood in stunned silence. Kristin's mother, Denise, later said, "We now put our faith in the justice system. But we have been here before. We want closure, not headlines." The prosecution's theory. According to the district attorney's office, Paul Flores had raped or attempted to rape Kristin Smart in his dorm room the night of May 25, 1996. She had never made it back to her dorm, as he claimed. Instead, prosecutors alleged, Paul killed her, whether during or after the assault, and enlisted the help of his father to hide the body. They believed her remains were first hidden at Cal Poly, then secretly transported and buried under Ruben's deck, where they stayed for years. But the story didn't end there. When Paul came back under suspicion in recent years, especially after the success of Chris Lambert's podcast, Ruben allegedly dug up Kristin's body and moved it again. Her remains have still not been found. Inside the Flores family, search warrants revealed an unsettling pattern. Paul Flores had a history of sexual violence. Multiple women came forward with similar stories. Paul would isolate them, often while drunk, and become aggressive or violent. Some described being drugged, others said they were assaulted in his home. These weren't just isolated incidents. They painted a disturbing portrait of a predator who had likely been violent long before Kristin disappeared, and continued to be violent long after. And the Flores household? Investigators found disturbing evidence of complicity. In Ruben's home, police found diaries, digital devices, and online searches that suggested active efforts to monitor Kristin's case, track media coverage, and stay ahead of investigators. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a quarter-century of calculated silence. The trial begins. In July 2022, the trial of Paul and Ruben Flores finally began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters of the Smart family, and even former Cal Poly students who still remembered the missing posters and candlelight vigils from 1996. The prosecution laid out their case. Paul Flores was the last person seen with Kristin. Cadaver dogs alerted his dorm room. Biological evidence was discovered beneath his father's deck. And numerous women testified to Paul's predatory behavior toward intoxicated or unconscious women. It was a circumstantial case. No body, no DNA, but it was strong. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the case lacked hard evidence, and that Kristin's disappearance could not be definitively tied to Paul Flores. They claimed the cadaver dog alerts were unreliable. They tried to cast doubt on the science behind the soil evidence. But the weight of 25 years, and the sheer volume of testimony, began to close in. Ruben's role, the father who helped bury the truth. For Ruben Flores, the prosecution's story was equally damning. They alleged that he helped Paul transport Kristin's body shortly after her murder and that he kept her remains hidden beneath his deck for years. The most chilling part? A wooden lattice structure had been installed under the deck. It wasn't for decoration. It was designed to hide the disturbed soil. Even worse, prosecutors presented photos that showed the lattice had been added only after Kristin disappeared. For the jury, it painted a picture not just of a murder, but of a cover-up spanning 2 generations. The verdict. On October 18, 2022, after months of emotional testimony and legal back and forth, the verdict was announced. Paul Flores was found guilty of the murder of Kristin Smart. For the Smart family, it was vindication. Tears flowed in the courtroom. Kristin's parents held hands. Her brother Chris wept. But for Ruben Flores, he was acquitted of being an accessory. The jury in Ruben's separate trial, which had been held concurrently in a different courtroom, was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he had helped hide Kristin's body. The Smart family, though disappointed, focused on the win. Paul Flores would spend the rest of his life in prison. The aftermath. Paul Flores is now an inmate at Pleasant Valley State Prison, serving 25 years to life with no possibility of parole for the murder of Kristin Smart. But the story is far from over. Kristin's remains have never recovered. For her family, justice is incomplete. Her mother, Denise Smart, said, "We have a conviction. We have accountability. But we still don't have Kristin. A man is behind bars. The truth, long buried, has clawed its way to the surface. But Kristin's final resting place remains unknown. What was it like for her family to live through these decades of darkness? And how did a podcast, not the police, become the key to justice?" For 23 years, the case of Kristin Smart remained buried, not just in the soil beneath a quiet suburban deck, but in the public's memory. A beautiful 19-year-old college freshman, gone without a trace. A suspect long known. A family broke up in silence. Nobody. No charges. No justice. Until a musician named Chris Lambert picked up a microphone and decided to tell her story. Not as a detective, not as a journalist, but as someone who couldn't stop thinking about the girl who never came home. His podcast, Your Own Backyard, didn't just reignite interest in Kristin's case, it broke it open. This is the story of how a podcaster did what the system couldn't, and why it changed everything. A small town, a lingering memory. Chris Lambert wasn't a crime reporter. He was a soft-spoken, thoughtful musician who grew up just outside San Luis Obispo, the same region where Kristin Smart vanished in 1996. Like many locals, Chris remembered the missing posters, the rumors, the unease. He remembered driving past the billboard that read, "Kristin Smart, missing since 1996. Somebody knows something." It had become a permanent fixture, a silent scream on the side of the road. And Chris started asking the same question everyone else had ignored for decades. Why hasn't this case been solved? In 2019, he decided to find out. Your Own Backyard begins. Chris began with a microphone and a question. What really happened to Kristin Smart? He interviewed former classmates, professors, and locals who remembered the case. He scoured old newspaper clippings. He obtained court records. But most importantly, he reached out to the Smart family, and they agreed to talk. Episodes by episode, Lambert built a case, a compelling, emotional, and meticulously researched narrative that did what law enforcement had failed to do for decades. It made Kristin Smart human again. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was the story of a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who had dreams, whose life was stolen, and whose killer had been allowed to walk free. An audience begins to listen. Lambert didn't have a marketing team or big studio backing him. But Your Own Backyard began to spread by word of mouth. It climbed podcast charts. It was picked up by major media outlets. And most importantly, it reached the ears of law enforcement. The San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office admitted that Lambert's podcast directly led to new witnesses coming forward. People who had been too afraid to speak, or who didn't realize what they knew mattered, or who thought the case was already solved. The podcast did what police interrogations, news stories, and public appeals couldn't. It made people talk, uncovering new witnesses. Among the most important contributions of Your Own Backyard were witnesses who'd never been contacted by law enforcement. One woman told Lambert about a disturbing conversation she had with Paul Flores at a party, where he bragged about sex acts and made chilling comments about Kristin. Another woman came forward claiming Paul had tried to assault her years after Kristin vanished. She'd never reported it, assuming nothing would come of it. Others described Paul's predatory behavior toward drunk or unconscious women, matching what prosecutors would later call a pattern of abuse. These weren't just rumors, they were puzzle pieces, and Lambert connected them one by one. The Flores family gets nervous. As the podcast gained traction, one thing became obvious. The Flores family was listening, too. Lambert reported strange behavior. People following him. Anonymous threats. Surveillance vans parked outside his home. He became the target of online harassment, all for telling a story the community had long tried to forget. But he didn't back down. When the podcast reached its 7th episode, titled The One Who Knows, Lambert made it clear. Paul Flores knows what happened to Kristin Smart. And someone in his family does too. That episode alone drew millions of downloads. And it got the attention of the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office, which soon issued a statement. The podcast has produced new information and leads, and we are actively pursuing them. Behind the scenes, the investigation roared back to life. Law enforcement returns. By early 2020, new search warrants were executed at multiple Flores properties, including Paul's home in San Pedro, his mother Susan's house, and his father Ruben's now infamous residence on White Court. They seized electronic devices, vehicles, items of interest, and most importantly, they began excavating beneath Ruben's deck. What they found was a forensic turning point. Disturbed soil, biological material, decomposition. Though Kristin's remains were not recovered, investigators believed they had finally found physical proof, and Lambert's work had helped lead them there. The power of persistence. Chris Lambert never sought fame. He didn't monetize his podcast at first. He refused ads. He didn't accept donations. He wasn't trying to profit. He just wanted to tell the truth. In an interview, he said, "It started as a side project. But once I met Kristin's family, it became a responsibility." Lambert gave voice to a girl who'd been forgotten. He gave strength to a family that had fought alone. And he gave justice the nudge it needed. The national impact. The success of Your Own Backyard changed more than just the Smart case. It sparked conversations about campus safety, the role of media in cold cases, citizen-led investigations, the failure of law enforcement to act early and aggressively. The podcast is now studied in journalism programs. It's credited with inspiring other investigative podcasts. And most importantly, it made people believe that persistence matters, that telling someone's story can be more powerful than a badge. The Smarts speak out. In the courtroom, during the murder trial of Paul Flores, the Smart family frequently cited the podcast. Not as evidence, but as a catalyst. Kristin's mother, Denise Smart, publicly thanked Chris Lambert. "Without Chris, I truly believe we'd still be waiting. He honored Kristin. He believed in her. He made people listen. A movement is born." Since the release of Your Own Backyard, other families of the missing have reached out to Lambert. Some want him to investigate their stories. Others just want guidance. The podcast became more than a show. It became a movement. Kristin's case is now one of the most well-known cold case breakthroughs in California history. Not because of a detective, but because of a civilian who simply cared too much to let the silence continue. A guilty verdict had been handed down. Paul Flores would rot in prison. But Kristin was still missing. And her family had one final mission: find her. In the next chapter, we explore how the search for Kristin's remains continues, and why some believe someone, even now, still knows where she is. A conviction is not closure. That's what Kristin Smart's family wants the world to understand. Yes, Paul Flores was convicted of Kristin's murder in 2022. Yes, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Yes, a measure of justice was finally delivered. But Kristin is still missing. Her body has never been recovered. And somewhere out there, beneath layers of soil or concrete, or secretly, she's still waiting to come home. A grave without a body. The Smarts held a small private service after Paul's conviction. A memorial, really. But it wasn't a funeral. There was no casket, no burial plot, no goodbye. Because there was nothing to bury. Kristin Smart had become one of America's most well-known missing persons cases. And even after her killer was behind bars, the most essential truth still haunted her family. We don't know where our daughter is. They had answers, but not the answer. Ruben Flores, the man who knows. To many, including prosecutors, investigators, and the Smart family, Ruben Flores still holds the key. Though he was acquitted of being an accessory, the public saw something else. A man who shielded his son, concealed a crime, and likely knew where Kristin's body had been hidden, and possibly where it is now. The case against Ruben was weakened in court by a lack of physical surveillance tying him to the body's relocation. But the evidence around his home told a different story. Cadaver dogs had alerted him beneath his deck. Ground-penetrating radar showed a disturbed void. Biological material consistent with human decomposition was recovered. A wooden lattice had been installed after Kristin vanished, covering only the space where the soil had changed. All signs pointed to this. Kristin had once been buried there, and someone had moved her. The most likely suspect, Ruben Flores. The midnight move. One witness, a former tenant living in Ruben's home in the early 2000s, recalled an odd late-night event. She said that Ruben and a group of men had spent hours in the backyard after dark, digging, carrying materials, whispering. She didn't think much of it then. But now, in retrospect, it felt like a clandestine exhumation. And afterward, the smell beneath the deck disappeared. The ground looked different. And Kristin, once buried there, was now gone again. But where did they move her? The theories of where Kristin could be. Even now, law enforcement continues to investigate multiple potential burial sites. The search remains active, though mostly quiet. But several key locations are believed to be under scrutiny. 1. The Flores family properties. Paul's mother, Susan Flores, owns a home in Arroyo Grande, where cadaver dogs also alerted during an earlier search. The soil there has never been fully excavated. Could Kristin have been reburied on Susan's property after being moved from Ruben's? Some investigators believe so. Others think it would have been too risky. 2. Remote agricultural fields. The Flores family has long had ties to agricultural areas and rural land outside Arroyo Grande. Investigators have hinted that these locations are difficult to search due to their size and terrain, but not impossible. Chris Lambert, the podcaster who helped revive the case, has said, "I think she's somewhere very simple. Somewhere close. They wouldn't risk traveling far." 3. Concrete slabs and new construction. Some believe Kristin may now lie beneath a concrete slab, possibly poured after 2000, when Ruben allegedly moved her body. Why? Concrete prevents decomposition from being detected by scent or radar. It eliminates soil voids. It makes excavation time-consuming and expensive, unless there's a warrant. This theory suggests that Kristin is beneath something permanent, something made to keep her hidden forever. The family's quiet agony. For the Smart family, every day without Kristin is a reopened wound. They've visited suspected sites. They've stood silently on dirt lots and under power lines, imagining their daughter's final resting place. Kristin's father, Stan Smart, once said, "Every night, I lay awake wondering, is she cold? Is she alone? Can she be brought home?" These are not questions a parent should ever have to ask. Why recovery matters. Some people wonder, why is recovering Kristin's remains still so important? Isn't justice already served? But that's not how grief works. And that's not how justice finishes. Without her body, there's no place to mourn. No truth about what she endured. No answers about her final moments. No closure. And for legal purposes, certain charges, like rape, which prosecutors suspect occurred, remain unproven without a body. Kristin isn't a symbol. She was a person. A daughter, a sister, a friend, and she deserves to be found. A grave made of silence. If Ruben Flores knows where Kristin is, he hasn't spoken. If Paul Flores confessed to anyone in jail, that information hasn't surfaced. And if someone else helped relocate Kristin, a contractor, a friend, even an unknowing accomplice, they haven't come forward. The code of silence around the Flores family has held for over 2 decades. But silence can crack. People age. Guilt festers. And even the deepest secrets eventually rise, just like Kristin's memory did. The search continues. Even after Paul's conviction, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office has made it clear. This case remains open. We are still working to recover Kristin. Cadaver dogs continue to train. New search technologies are being explored. And private investigators have joined the effort to pinpoint where Kristin might have been moved. Her face still appears on missing person sites. Her name still echoes in courtrooms, classrooms, and candlelight vigils. And on the billboard along the highway, one line remains. Somebody knows something. What it would mean to find her. For the Smart family, finding Kristin would mean more than answers. It would mean being able to say goodbye. It would mean being able to place a headstone. To honor her properly. To give her a final resting place not built of secrets and soil, but of dignity and peace. Until then, she remains the girl lost in the dark, kept hidden by the very people who stole her future. She was taken in the dead of night, buried under lies, moved like evidence, hidden by silence. But Kristin Smart is still out there, waiting to be brought home. And in the final part of this story, we'll answer the most haunting question of all. What has this case changed? For Cal Poly, for college campuses, for families of the missing, and for every girl who never made it back from the party. For 25 years, the name Kristin Smart meant heartache. A girl lost, a case gone cold, a system that failed. But today, Kristin's name means something else too: change. In the final chapter of this haunting story, we look at the ripple effect of her disappearance. Because it didn't just lead to a trial. It helped spark a transformation in how campuses respond to danger, how families fight for the missing, and how silence is no longer the final word. This is Kristin Smart's legacy. A life interrupted, but not forgotten. Kristin Smart was just 19 years old when she vanished on May 25, 1996. She was a college freshman, tall, athletic, full of life. Her parents say she dreamed of traveling the world, of becoming a teacher, maybe a writer. She had a contagious laugh. She was passionate about learning and making people smile. But all of that was stolen the night she left a party at Cal Poly and never came home. What followed was a decades-long collapse of responsibility. From campus officials, from law enforcement, from a community that looked the other way. But the story didn't end in silence. It ended with a reckoning. How Cal Poly failed, and what changed. In the weeks after Kristin disappeared, California Polytechnic State University did not treat her like a missing person. Despite reports that she'd been intoxicated, passed out on a lawn, and walked home with an unknown male student, the campus police waited 3 days to alert local authorities. At the time, Cal Poly considered her a runaway, a student who had maybe left on her own. The fact that her purse, ID, and belongings were still in her dorm room didn't seem to matter. The result: critical time was lost, and a potential crime scene, the dorm room of Paul Flores, was never secured. But the uproar that followed eventually led to a landmark law, the Kristin Smart Campus Safety Act of 1998. In 1998, California passed the Kristin Smart Campus Safety Act, named in her honor. The law requires all California colleges and universities, public and private, to immediately contact local law enforcement when a student is reported missing under suspicious circumstances. In other words, no more waiting, no more bureaucratic delays, no more hiding behind campus jurisdiction. This act became a national model, forcing schools to reevaluate how they handle missing persons cases, especially when foul play is suspected. Kristin's disappearance changed policy, and that change may have saved lives. A family that never stopped. The Smart family didn't just grieve. They fought. For years, they held press conferences. They hired private investigators. They pushed lawmakers, sued officials, and battled through courtrooms. They set up the Kristin Smart Scholarship Fund to support young women pursuing education in the sciences. They created advocacy networks for other families of the missing. And they became the public face of a tragic reality. When your child goes missing, you enter a club no parent ever wants to join. Denise and Stan Smart never stopped looking for their daughter. And even today, after a conviction, they remain active in the search to bring her home. Their message to other families is simple. Don't give up. Don't accept silence. Push. Every day. The rise of civilian investigators. Kristin's case became a turning point in another way. It showed the world how citizen journalism and independent investigations could crack cold cases. Chris Lambert, the creator of the Your Own Backyard podcast, wasn't a detective. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just someone who cared and had a microphone. But his work brought forward new witnesses, reignited national attention, forced law enforcement to act, and gave the Smarts something they hadn't had in years: hope. Lambert's podcast became a blueprint. Since then, dozens of true crime podcasts have helped reopen cases, generate leads, and hold institutions accountable. Kristin's story wasn't just a mystery, it was a movement, a warning to campuses everywhere. Colleges across the country paid attention to what happened at Cal Poly. Since the Kristin Smart Campus Safety Act, many universities have implemented campus-wide alert systems, required escort programs for late-night student travel, trained staff and students in bystander intervention, increased the visibility of sexual assault prevention programs. Kristin's case showed the fatal cost of complacency, of assuming a student is just blowing off steam or taking a break. It showed how one ignored report could mean a life lost forever. A warning to predators. Paul Flores lived free for 26 years. He went on to have multiple run-ins with the law. He was accused of sexually assaulting other women, and now faces allegations from at least 4 additional survivors. But the lesson here isn't just about how long he got away with it. It's that eventually, he didn't. Thanks to advances in forensic science, digital evidence, and public accountability, the net is closing on predators who once thought they were untouchable. Kristin's case showed that even decades later, justice can still knock on the door. The girl who wasn't forgotten. Through all of this, the podcast, the trial, the billboards, the decades of pain, one face remained at the center: Kristin's. She is now taught in criminal justice classes. Her case is cited in safety training across the country. She's the reason dozens of families know how to fight when their loved ones go missing. Kristin Smart didn't just disappear. She became a name that changed lives. And yet, she's still missing. Despite everything, the conviction, the spotlight, the national reforms, Kristin Smart has not been found. Her body remains hidden. Somewhere in a quiet place, there is still a girl who hasn't come home. The Smart family continues to ask for leads. Search teams remain prepared. And the San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Office insists the case is not over. What Kristin deserves. Kristin deserves more than justice. She deserves rest. She deserves a marker with her name. She deserves peace. And she deserves a world where no other student is left behind. Where no report is ignored. Where no family has to fight this hard, just to be heard. Final words from her family. In a heartbreaking yet hopeful statement, Denise Smart once said, "They took her life, but they didn't take her voice." That lives on, in every mother who now knows what to do, in every student who comes home safe, and in every case that refuses to be forgotten. Ending summary. The final legacy. This is the story of a party, a secret, and 25 years of silence. A silence that was broken, a truth that was exposed, and a girl who changed the world, even in her absence. Kristin Smart is not just a name from the past. She is a symbol of what happens when people care too much to look away. This was her story, and we'll remember her until the day she is finally brought home. What did you think of the case? Please share your thoughts in the comment below. If you want more video like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. See you in the next one.